When you crack open a fantasy book nowadays, you are fairly likely to find a map. It's usually all in black and white, with lots of crinkly little coastlines and strange places labeled in fun fonts. Or maybe you're into tabletop role-playing games, where the dungeon master almost always starts out by laying out a map. Or maybe you play fantasy video games, where maps are quite often a lore-dumping strategy and a mechanism for moving around the world of the game. Either way, maps have become so ubiquitous within the fantasy genre that there are hundreds of guides and techniques, websites and generators, entire subreddits dedicated to the craft of fantasy cartography. It's kind of a given part of world building. But why is that? Because in the actual medieval period, the period that a lot of these fantasy stories are, loosely set in, maps were rare, expensive, and most of them didn't do a very good job of actually helping you get from one place to another. Besides, fantasy is fictional. So why is it that we are so desperate to measure, scale, and accurately depict these worlds that are so fundamentally unreal? Well, I would propose that it's because all real-world maps are, in a way, inherently unreal. They're all a kind of work of fiction. By tracing the history of maps, by looking at a lot of really weird ones, and by following the trajectory of fantasy cartography, I hope to navigate us to a better understanding of fantasy maps as an art form and as a storytelling device. So get ready and buckle up, folks. Or don't. You probably shouldn't actually be driving during this one, because then you won't be able to look at all the pretty maps I put on screen, and I will sound insane trying to describe them without you being able to see them. So, maybe actually watch this one. Something that has always baffled me as a cartographically challenged person is how maps were made at all before, satellites. I personally could point you down the road in the general direction of the local graveyard, but I couldn't draw out the roads, sidewalks, deer paths, and back roads that you have to use to actually get yourself there. I've been to quite a few shores in my lifetime, but I couldn't draw a single one out on a map, no matter how much money you paid me. And it is true that before modern technology, it was very hard to draw a fully accurate map, which is why a lot of early cartographers didn't try to draw out a map in accurate, minuscule detail. One of the earliest maps that modern archaeology has discovered is the Turin papyrus map from around 1150 BC in Egypt. It depicts the geology of an area, the gold mines and deposits, and travel routes to get to them. Is it in scale? No, but it could help you plan, work, and get from one place to another, because it gave you a general sense of the space that you were working in. But even then, not every map was supposed to be practical. The Imago Mundi from somewhere between the 9th and 7th century BC depicts the entire world as the artist knew it. The Babylonian tablet shows the Euphrates River, various cities, mountains, and swamps, as well as the ring of the circular ocean around it. This map, unlike the Turin papyrus map, wouldn't be very helpful for the traveler with his feet on the ground, but rather it served a higher purpose. It allowed someone to understand the entirety of the world around them, and more importantly, their place inside the world. Since true proportion and distance was very difficult to replicate, early maps endeavored to serve a different purpose. In 1154, geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi created an atlas with over 70 maps, beautifully depicting the known world. This was not made in scale, but rather it was a collection of knowledge about these places and the people that inhabited them. He described climatic zones, the weather and temperatures. He showed what was there, not just where it was. Al-Idrisi used a coordinate system to describe the spatial relationship between things, and in this way, he created a revolutionary and highly useful guide for travelers, without ever actually trying to chart out what a place actually looked like. Throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, this developed into the tradition of the mapamundi, or the world map. And to our modern eyes, these mapamundi are not recognizable as world maps at all. And that's because they were not made to communicate geography, but other things like anthropology, philosophy, and religion. They used metaphorical and artistic language to communicate truths, just not geographical truths. For example, almost all medieval mapamundi are oriented with the east at the top of the map instead of the north, as we've become used to. This is because the Garden of Eden was in the east, and as the birthplace of humanity, it got the prime place on the map. These were not literal maps, they were symbolic maps. And from this symbolism, we get the idea of so-called T and O maps. These maps are simplified circular maps, O-shaped, where the three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, are divided up by the T-shaped waters of the Nile, the River Don, and the Black Sea. In this map from Isidore of Seville, you can clearly see how symbolic and simplified this map is. No one who needed to get themselves from Rome to Paris was going to go to this map in order to help them get there, but a priest giving a homily might point to this map while trying to explain a religious truth to his parish. This was not literally true, but spiritually true according to how they saw the world. This tradition gave us even crazier looking maps, such as the Bunting cloverleaf, in which all the continents of the world form a Trinitarian shape, all focused around the hub of Jerusalem, the Holy Land. This was a common feature of the mapamundi, representative of how Jerusalem was the heart of the spiritual world. But we do find less simplified T and O maps, such as the Borgia map. The Borgia map is packed with elephants and dragons, stick figures, and battles. And of course, a good deal of text, information about what was on the map and why it was there. The mapamundi was like an encyclopedia, containing all of the knowledge, the history, philosophy, and religion of the medieval period. These maps were not just representing space, they represented the meaning of space. But the most iconic extant mapamundi of all time is the Hereford map from the year 1300. This is one of the largest and best preserved maps from this time, drawn onto a huge ox hide nearly 6 feet long. At the top of this map, we see Jesus Christ presiding over the world, specifically over the Garden of Eden, which is circled by a ring of fire. Although loosely following the T and O map structure, east-oriented with Jerusalem at the center and the continents around it, the Hereford map is stunningly detailed, especially in Europe and the Middle East, where they had a lot of geographical input. In the areas unknown to them, especially on the southern side of the map, we can see images of the people and things that they supposed might populate these empty spaces. Unicorns, centaurs, and mandrakes. There are human-esque figures with 4 eyes, and some specifically labeled as those with whom there is no friendship, which just feels a little mean. I mean, he seems nice. The Hereford Cathedral map is the quintessential mapamundi, packed with information not just about the world, but the world as they saw it. And they were not ignorant of the literal inaccuracies. There's text on the map describing the actual distance between things, they just didn't see the point in trying to accurately scale that for this map. And although this looks crazy to us, it's actually not all too far off from how we nowadays use maps. As is described in How to Lie with Maps, a good map tells a multitude of little white lies. It suppresses truth to help the user see what needs to be seen. Reality is three-dimensional, rich in detail, and far too factual to allow a complete yet uncluttered two-dimensional graphic scale model. Indeed, a map that did not generalize would be useless. A British farmer from the year 1300 has very little need to know the exact shape of the Mediterranean Sea, or the precise mileage from Jerusalem to Cairo, but a map like this could teach him things about the supremacy of Christ, the importance of Jerusalem as the Holy Land, and the relationship of Europe to the rest of the continents of the world. These maps were not practical, but they were a really valuable visual teaching tool, and although they may not be necessarily accurate, that doesn't mean that they're a sign of ignorance. Considering the people of the past ignorant is a really unfortunate human habit, and it's very pervasive. Almost everyone does it. I assume it stems from some kind of a desire for a superiority complex. You want to feel better, you want to feel like we're improving. And so in order to do that, you put the people of the past down. You assume that because medieval people didn't bathe in the same way that we do, that they all smelled horrible and were disgusting all the time, just because literacy wasn't as widespread as it is now. We assume that the people of the past couldn't read, and couldn't understand the difference between nonfiction and fiction. And this can also lead to the belief that the people of the past saw a map like this one, and assumed that that was what the world actually looked like. And this idea also gave birth to even more misconceptions, such as the idea that the people of the past thought that the world was flat. And this idea, that everybody in the past thought that the world was flat until Christopher Columbus, is such a common thing that I didn't even realize it wasn't true until this week, while doing research for this video. And I know that it's a little bit off topic, but I'm really fired up about it, and I'm really mad that I only just found out about this, so allow me to rant for a moment. The world is a globe. If that is a point that you feel the need to debate me on, this is not the channel for you, but we've known that the world is a globe since, like, ancient Greece, at least. Looking at the stars tells us so, looking at the horizon, especially when you're on the sea, tells us so. Sure, there was always going to be a part of the population that just didn't care one way or another if the world was flat or round, because they were too busy, like, subsistence farming and starving and stuff. But the majority of people who thought about it hard enough did understand that the world was round and not flat. You can go ahead and check out these resources. If you want to fact check me, here's a couple of books that you can read if you're just realizing this now, like I am. But the unfortunate thing is that it's more likely that there are more flat earthers today than there were in the past, which is really depressing. So why did we think that people thought that the world was flat? Yeah, you guessed it right. It was the Victorians. The Victorians were particularly guilty of making everyone in the past look stupid. Plus, there was a fictional piece written about Christopher Columbus in this time, in which Christopher Columbus was worried about sailing off the side of the ocean. And that was taken not as fiction, but as fact. And so this idea has just continued to spread to the point where we're being taught it in school. And there are a lot of reasons this idea spread, partly because we're gullible, and partly because people wanted to make the Catholic Church look bad. But the fact is that I think because modern maps are relatively accurate, especially compared to the mapamundi, and that's the way we perceive maps to be, we just looked at the way that they drew the world and said, wow, they must think that that was what the world actually looked like. And you know what? I cannot do a survey from the year 1300 to 1400 to figure out whether people actually believed mapamundi were real representations of space, because most of the people from that time are dead. But our research does lead us to believe that most people did understand that the mapamundi was in some way a work of fiction. This is supported by the fact that alongside the development of the mapamundi, we also had the development of practical maps that tried, at least, to accurately represent geography. We have old Roman maps, such as the Peutinger Table, which was a traveler's guide along Roman roads. And although the scale for this map wasn't accurate, the map did accurately indicate where towns and waypoints were along the road, and it was very practical and very helpful for travelers. Around the year 150, Greco-Roman scholar Ptolemy created an atlas called Geographia. While no actual drawn-out maps survived from this manuscript, within the text of it, he did line out how, using science and math, someone might go about constructing an accurate map. Ptolemy dealt with issues of projection, taking a 3D object of the globe and translating it onto a flat page, and he used astronomy to calculate longitude longitude and latitude. Although lost for some time, Ptolemy's Geographia reemerged in the 15th century, and it revolutionized the process of cartography, especially for sailors, who really needed accurate maps of coasts and the open ocean in order to sail safely. Using tools like astrolabes and magnetic compasses, they began charting out the world as they saw it, creating strikingly accurate maps to guide their journeys. The oldest one that we found is the Carta Pisana from around 1275. And although it's non-specific about the geography of the land, it shows ports and coastlines in stunning detail. This map is also notable in that it has the north at the top of the map, rather than the east, as was standard for the mapamundi. At this point, cartography can be divided into two separate fields, the practical and the artistic. But as both of these traditions developed and as new discoveries were made, the lines between these two traditions began to blur. In 1320, Marino Sanudo combined the mapamundi and the sea chart. As you can see, there's a wealth of text on the page, and the world is in its neat circle with its continental divides, and the east is prioritized on the top of the map. However, Sanudo also made use of rhumb lines, indicators of the globe's curve. The Mediterranean is shaped more in accordance to sea charts, and the Holy Land is uncentered and unemphasized. The Catalan Atlas from 1375 is another excellent example of these transitional maps. It includes the symbolism and doctrine of a mapamundi, but it also takes on a rectangular shape, and it depicts their known geography with far more accuracy than, say, the Borgia map. Perhaps the most notable transitional map is from 1450, created by Fra Mauro. The Fra Mauro mapamundi is in the classic circle, but it's oriented north, and the continents have a bit more detail. He even included the Indian Ocean. Not only is the Fra Mauro map a really fascinating combination of these two cartographic styles, the fact that it was produced as late as 1450 proves that mapamundi were still quite in demand for centuries after we could technically produce something more accurate. It remains true that for some portion of the population, the encyclopedic knowledge of a mapamundi was just as, if not more valuable than a literal map. Now, of course, it wasn't going to stay that way forever. In the 1490s, with the discovery of the Americas just on the horizon, the shape of the world was coming into clearer and clearer view, and maps realized that they should start making room for new discoveries. On the so-called Columbus map, which probably was not made by Columbus himself, we see a side-by-side presentation of a mapamundi next to a practical sea chart. The Germanus map was rendered in full color and lavish detail, but it presented a much more accurate depiction of the shape of the continents, especially the tail of Africa, which they had just learned was circumnavigable. Around 1490, we also have the earliest surviving globe, created by Martin Beheim. Called the Erdapfel, or Earth Apple, this map beautifully bridged old tradition and new discoveries. There's illustrations and text praising the wealth held in distant lands. However, it doesn't include America, because that discovery had not come back to Europe yet. Rather, the edges of Europe and Asia, wrapping around the globe, are portrayed as a simple hop, skip, and a jump from each other. Soon enough, word of the Americas would be brought back to Europe, and the maps would have to shift to allow space for it. But at this point, geographers, cartographers, and explorers were realizing the vast potential of open water. No longer was the ocean a thin band on the exterior of the landmass. It was now vast and traversable. The mapamundi left many portions of land marked as uninhabitable and barren. But on these new maps, these lands were instead just undiscovered and bristling with potential. As time passed, these more technically accurate maps would become the dominant form, but I don't think that we as a species ever forgot the time when maps did not need to be accurate to tell the truth. In fact, the world map that so many of us would recognize today has its own fair share of little white lies. In 1569, the Mercator projection was introduced, which takes the globe and lays it out flat. This makes for a very clear and easy to read map, and by the 19th century or so, this map had become the standard in most educational settings. The problem is that as accurate as this map is, it's also not. What Mercator did is he took the rhumb lines running up and down the curves of the globe and he straightened them out. He laid it all flat. He sliced the globe into even slices, laid them out, and then stretched out the map to fill in the gaps. This means that the further away from the equator you get, the less accurate the scale of the map is. The further away from the equator, the more distorted. Now, is this distortion going to be an issue when you are 8 years old and you're using this map to study all of the capitals of South America? No, of course not. But it is indicative that even the modern maps that we rely on today are built on little lies. They are all works of fiction. Between projection and scale and symbolization, no map can be completely true. And because a map is not true, the choices that you make, the choices in symbolization, scale, and projection, can change the way that the map is perceived and the way that the person perceiving the map gets their information. And that means that as printing made maps more and more accessible, maps were often weaponized, especially in the case of colonization. The countries of Europe, having discovered all of these new uninhabited lands, found it very easy to sit there and just color in a continent and claim it for themselves. And if you take that map with the colored in continent showing that it's yours and distribute it to enough of your people, they're all going to assume that the map is true, that that land is theirs. You can draw a line on a map and then you have a country. You can draw in a star to show that there's a city in a place and most of your population will come to think that's true. You can divide up an entire continent without ever leaving your desk. Now, does that mean that the land itself, or the people that already live on that land, are going to respect those arbitrary borders? No. However, it does give your soldiers and your army the permission that they need to take what they think is theirs. A map can choose to dissolve one boundary and reassert another. They are a very powerful tool. Not just because they depict the land, but because they shape it by shaping people's perception of it. This really comes to a head in the case of propaganda. For example, the new government of Germany during the Second World War used maps as propaganda to great effect. In this map from 1940, they highlight the disparity of landmass between Germany and the British Empire. They ask, how could little bitty Germany be the aggressor against such a huge territory? A map can show who's the good guy and who's the bad guy to a very great effect. Maps can even be used in the somewhat less malicious case of advertising. In How to Lie with Maps, they give the example of a railway line, trying to convince potential clients that their railway is the fastest and most efficient way to get around. In reality, the railway map may look like this. However, with a little bit of adjusting, the railway map that they post in stations looks like this. Now, is this map accurate? Sure, in the sense that all of those stations are indeed one after another on the line, it is accurate. But in the sense that the railway actually physically is line-shaped, less so. It is impossible to have an unbiased map. Every decision that you have to make while making a map says something and means something. And throughout the modern period, this has been used for both good and catastrophically bad purposes. So now that we understand that all maps are fiction, let's talk about maps specifically made for fiction. And we've been making maps to depict fictional places and stories since as early as the 15th century. Around 1485, Botticelli produced a whole series of illustrations illustrating Dante's Divine Comedy, and within it is an illustration titled The Map of Hell. Although not a flat, overhead map, the piece displays the many layers of hell and included multiple depictions of Dante and Virgil on their journey through it. We see the scenes from Inferno laid out, illustrated graphically, to get a better overall image of what Dante was describing. It was a map. Now, the question of whether Dante's Divine Comedy counts as fiction is another video entirely in itself. Of course, Dante did believe that the story was spiritually true because it was a religious allegory, but it could be debated as to whether he thought that was literally true and that was literally the experience that humans went through. Either way, I think at least by modern perspective, Botticelli's illustrations of Dante's Divine Comedy were fictional illustrations of a fictional story. There's a lot of spiritual truth that can be collected from the story and from these illustrations, but it is understood that these are not literally true. A more uncomplicatedly fictional map comes from Jonathan Swift's 1726 Gulliver's Travels. Travel voyages and accounts were massively popular at that time, and although they were published as non-fiction, most of them were exaggerated or just blatantly fictional in some places, and Gulliver's Travels satirizes those travel and voyage accounts by creating an even more blatantly exaggerated and fictional travel story, and he even included the maps that typically appeared at the beginning of these travel voyage collections. The maps of Gulliver's Travels were based off of existing maps of the time, augmented with the fictional islands described in Swift's novel. This only added to the illusion of realism, although these maps were not necessarily well done. They're blatant traces done by an amateur, to the point where one map contains the word Sunda, a word which means absolutely nothing without the larger context of the map that it had been traced from, which reads the Sunda Islands. Whatever amateur artists they hauled in to make these copies, they didn't even pay enough attention to the map that they traced to see the full, originally printed label, because it was outside of the exact purview of what they were tracing. But to me, the kind of half-assed rip-off nature of these maps, it makes the story way more enchanting. Gulliver's Travels itself is meant to be a kind of a rip-off, a satire, and these maps, whether intentionally or not, contribute to that very well. Beginning in the mid-16th century, we also see maps beginning to be included in the beginnings of publications such as the Bible. These were printed with the proposed purpose to present clearly to the reader's eye what is otherwise difficult to grasp from text alone. Of course, these maps were not fake, they were depicting the real places mentioned in the Bible, but it just goes to show that beginning by the 16th century or earlier, maps were becoming very linked to the enjoyment of literature. And as the format of the novel and the craft of fiction became more and more widespread, these maps also were frequently printed within the pages of these books. In 1883, Treasure Island was accompanied by a depiction of the Treasure Island in the stylings of a nautical map. The lines, the compass rose, the carefully marked shores show it to be a sailing map. It establishes style and tone, and introduces the reader to the setting in a way that gets them excited for the voyage that is to come. Maps even became common fare in the publication of children's literature. Later editions of Winnie the Pooh included a map of the 100-Acre Woods. Fun little anecdote, once my family went to visit the 100-Acre Woods while we were still living in England, and we got desperately lost in the 100-Acre Woods, and we ended up stranded in Eeyore's gloomy place. And let me tell you what, the map included in the book was absolutely no help. And to be fair, it's not striving for accuracy. There's no scale, there's no rum lines, the compass literally spells out the bear's name. This map is the kind of map that a kid would draw, as a fun way to portray his favorite places to play. It shows who and what the woods are, rather than specifically where everything is. Maps were also printed in L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Colorful and blocky, this map resembles the world it describes, filled with strange names and shapes. The map is also interesting because although north and south hold true to the typical placement, east and west are flipped, with the east on the left side. It is possible that this was just a mistake made by Baum, but it was maintained in some later editions, so it's possible that it was just a nod to the topsy-turvy, our world but different land of Oz. So maps were used in a lot of literature throughout the 1900s, but they did not specifically become the fare of fantasy literature until they fell into the hands of one J.R.R. Tolkien. The maps that Tolkien included in his stories are just iconic. The maps of The Hobbit are both introductory material for the reader and included as part of the storyline. And what's fascinating about this map is that although it uses a lot of cartography conventions that emerged far after the medieval period that infuses Middle-earth, Tolkien does orient this particular map with east facing up, just as the 14th century mapamundi. He has an in-lore explanation for this. Apparently dwarven compasses are just read differently, but I can't help but see it as a nod to the orientation of the medieval map, even if this map itself has next to nothing in common with the actual visuals used in the medieval period. And as the fantasy of The Hobbit expanded into The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien continued to make cartography a very important part of his fantasy world. In his legendary Map of Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age, Tolkien proves just how much more a map can say outside of geography. The map shows the western shore of Middle-earth, and by choosing this particular shore, Tolkien evoked all of the cultural connotations around Western Europe. It calls to mind the grand medieval period, castles and European kings, storybook romance and heroic drama. The outer edges of the map are only thinly populated, and they fade into ambiguity, just as the medieval perspective filled in details on the known land and left the unknown bare. It is in the central west that the map is populated with man-made things, towns, fortresses, roads, and castles. Even the shape of Middle-earth itself is evocative, the chain of mountains forming an S-curve that nearly traces the journey that the Fellowship will take, its tail pointing to the final destination. The mountains surrounding Mordor are distinctly artificial in appearance, hinting that the land may have, or may continue to be manipulated by forces larger than geology. Even the way that the text is written on this map can tell us a great deal. Tolkien plays with capitalization, font, and size, all to tell us what we need to know about a place at a glance. The text is also red, contrasting sharply from the black world beneath it, perhaps cluing the viewer into the importance of names in this philologically derived world. There's numerous instances where Tolkien lists the Elven name of a place, followed by the English in parentheses. Here he is asserting the supremacy, or at least the originality, of the Elven tongue. The Elven names are not a translation of the English names, the common tongue names are a translation of the Elvish ones. And just as important as what Tolkien included on this map are the things that he chose not to include. He doesn't draw in political boundaries or countries. There's no system for designating a capital city versus a town. When it comes to understanding Middle-earth, politics are less important than names and nature. Many areas of the map are left blank, leaving the imagination to fill the gaps of wilderness. Through something as seemingly simple as this map, Tolkien laid a lot of his world-building groundwork. He set the tone for Middle-earth without many people that look at this map even realizing it. Tolkien also believed that maps like this one were essential to crafting a believable secondary world. His idea of a secondary fictional world was one that needed to be airtight. Despite being fictional, it needed to feel real in as many ways as possible, as much as possible. This meant that things like geography, geology, topography, and distances all had to make sense. And what better way to keep track of all of this than through maps? In a letter, he wrote, "I wisely started with a map and made the story fit, generally with meticulous care for distances. The other way about lands one in confusions and impossibilities, and in any case it is weary work to compose a map from a story." Basing Middle-earth on a map turned out to be a huge help, and occasionally a hindrance to Tolkien's perfectionistic writing process. There are many letters that he wrote where he is panicking because he can't get the maps quite right. Eventually, his son Christopher began helping him actually draw the maps, but then Tolkien ran into the problem of discovering that his works, things that he had written, were not matching up to what the maps depicted, and these differences had to be rectified. And although these particularities definitely slowed down Tolkien's writing process, I do think that they contributed to what makes Middle-earth so special. By using maps as such an integral part of his work, Tolkien inadvertently created a permanent association between this particular style of map and medieval fantasy fiction. Which is really interesting because, as you know, as I have just told you, medieval maps didn't look like this at all. And if we're looking for an explanation for this, beyond the fact that mapamundi looked crazy and weren't very practical, I think that hobbits are our ticket. Included in the text of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien also provides us with a map of the Shire, or part of the Shire at least. And this is a map that exists both for the reader in the context of the book that they're reading, but it also exists canonically within the world. It was a map created by hobbits for hobbits, and you can tell. It is a map that is both artistic and functional. The presence of easily traversable roads, towns, and farms gives the idea of nature somewhat tamed. The named farthings imply some form of government, the presence of the old forest lends history and depth, and the whole thing is centered on the farthing stone, as the heart of this familiar country. The hobbits also leave plenty of blank space on their maps, because the Shire is the kind of predictable place where you know just what fills the blanks. The blanks are not the blanks of the mapamundi or the open seas of Columbus, strange and bristling with new possibilities. These blanks are entirely predictable. We know that those are probably farm fields and wandering pathways, groves of trees and sparkling little streams. The Shire is a predictable, familiar place, and the map leads us to fill the gaps in with whatever seems to us the most familiar. The way that this map is written tells us as much about the cartographer that made it as it does the actual place it depicts, as non-medieval and anachronistic to Middle-earth as the hobbits are. Now, with that context, I interpret the big Middle-earth map as a hobbit's rendition of Middle-earth. The styling between these two maps is similar enough. They're written in the same cartographical language. If this map was truly medieval and it was oriented east, framed by the ominous Valar, filled with strange, indescribable things, completely geographically inaccurate, I think that that would scare off a fair number of readers. It would make Middle-earth seem like a completely alien place, which it is in some ways, but that's not how Tolkien introduces the world to us. He introduces us to it through the Shire, through something familiar and safe, just like his map is familiar and safe. This map is not just world building in the sense that it shows the world in which the story is going to take place. It is very intentional world building. It is artistry, with meaning and lore and beauty built into every drop of ink. The word iconic just doesn't do justice to how influential Tolkien's maps have been. In 1969, Pauline Baynes was commissioned to do a beautiful full-color illustration of them, but the simple black and red originals have truly stood the test of time. Just as Tolkien accidentally shaped so many aspects of the modern fantasy genre, so it became standard to include a map when you're introducing people to a fictional world. And I think that this can be most clearly seen through parody. Diana Wynne Jones's A Tough Guide to Fantasyland opens, "What to do first? Step 1, find the map. It will be there. No tour of Fantasyland is complete without one. It will be found in the front part of your brochure. Especially in the early days of the fantasy genre, in the sword and sorcery years of the 70s and the 80s, maps were very, very popular. Whether they were provided in the book, whether they were included in posters and brochures, or whether they were designed by fans, a lot of fantasy ended up with a map, because they were inspired by Tolkien's legacy. Now, to be completely fair, according to one study, in contemporary fantasy novels, only about 1/3 of them actually start with a map. But between, fantasy role-playing games and fantasy video games and just cultural connotations, maps have become an unavoidable part of the genre. But since the days of Tolkien, these maps have changed a lot, and nowadays there are authors doing very interesting things with them. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series opens with 2 maps, each showing a part of his world. In subsequent publications, there would be more and more maps provided, but none of these were comprehensive. Rather, in an effort to keep his audience in a similar headspace to the pseudo-medieval person, Martin only provided little unscaled maps. They're very difficult to put together, and it's almost impossible to get a clear overview of the entire continent. You can learn where you are and what is in your vicinity, but the larger picture is always going to be a bit blurry. The Game of Thrones TV show would make even more use of these maps, featuring them in their title sequences. Every episode, the sequence would change, showing the specific parts of the map that the episode played out in. This is such an interesting way to use maps, especially in the medium of TV, where they're very rarely used, because even though you have multiple storylines spinning out across continents, you can keep track of them because it all feels like it's taking place in the same world. Plus, the stylization of these opening sequences is delightfully anachronistic, cogs and gears clashing with these pseudo-medieval maps and symbols. It's a medieval fantasy, but in terms of its politics, it might as well be a machine. And while I do love a huge map, I also have a lot of respect for the authors that are willing to keep things much smaller scale. And one of these authors is Scott Lynch in his Lies of Loch Lamora, which takes place in the congested, Venice-inspired city of Camor. Sliced up by canals, the city is fragmented and dense, and the map, for all its simplicity, does a great job of representing this. The story lives in the grunge of the city, the twisted alleys and dirty gutters. If they had laid out every street on a neat map, we would have lost the mystery and the thrill of this fantastical criminal underworld. As always in maps, there's a great deal of potential in empty spaces, and by using very evocative names, Lynch lets us paint the details in ourselves, and he relies on the actual text of the novel to bring this map to life in our imaginations. But my all-time favorite fantasy map is found in Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan. Leviathan is an alternate history steampunk retelling of the First World War, and so the map that starts the book is our world, but it is fictionalized. In this story, the Allies have become Darwinists. They've learned how to genetically manipulate animals in order to have living weapons. And the Central Powers are clankers, who have perfected diesel machinery. And this map represents that perfectly. The artist, Keith Thompson, included an incredible amount of detail. The countries are depicted as what they contain and what they mean. Germany is literally poised as a weapon aiming to the west. The Ottoman Empire is a fracturing spyglass machine. Switzerland is a clock ticking away in wait. And Russia is a putrefied corpse, a breath away from death and still snapping its jaws. Keith Thompson based this map off of allegorical propaganda maps from the 20th century, such as this one, and the map for Leviathan perfectly sets out that this is our world, but an alternate world. It crams in a hefty amount of storytelling, and the art style perfectly matches the rest of the story. Now, I'll be honest, I don't personally think that every fantasy book needs a map. Maps don't really do anything for me personally. I like looking at them, but I don't get maps. And you could probably blame that on the fact that I grew up with GPS technology being fairly widespread, but I personally think it's because I have the brain of a 12th century Polish peasant stuck in my head. But either way, I can't get maps to make sense. I can't tell left from right at all, and I can't get the bird's eye view shape that a map gives me to make sense according to the 3D world that's actually in front of me. And honestly, I think that a lot of fantasy stories, if not most, can probably skate by without a map. They might even benefit from not having a map to hold them accountable to very specific particularities. If, for narrative purposes, you would like a journey from one place to another to take a week, if you don't have a map, you can just make it take a week, instead of having to say, oh, well, on my map it's only 3 days. Do I change the scale of the map, or do I inconvenience myself for the sake of writing this story? If you don't have a map, then there's nobody to double check your work, and I'll be honest, most people just aren't going to notice. Not having a map means that the audience gets to lay the world out in their own minds themselves. They get to see everything brand new without anticipating that this is the place we're going to go, and I know what that looks like because I've seen it on the map. It is a kind of magic. So with that in mind, in my opinion, if a book is going to have a map, I want there to be a reason for it to have a map. I don't want it to hold the story back. I want it to make the world that we're walking into feel more real. Because when it's done right, a really good map does so much more than simply saying where things are. The mapamundi of the past, in fact, were entirely unconcerned with where things were, but rather what they were, how they were, and why they were. And whether or not we realize it, modern maps, and especially fantasy maps, are just as capable of providing that kind of information. Things like science allow us to convince ourselves that we are in a privileged position of being able to be presented with information that is 100% true. But the thing is that all information, when it is being communicated from one mind to another, is communicated with bias. It is all inherently made up of story. The way that scientific information is presented to us can drastically change the way we think about it and whether or not we trust it. The news is entirely made up of stories and is very easy to fictionalize. Even history is a soft and malleable material, and something that seems as simple and factual as a map relies on our human instinct towards storytelling to turn a flat page and interpret that into something with infinite dimension. All maps are fictional, some more so than others, but we should always remember that these are tools created by human beings to make sense of the world around us, and how we use that tool to present information is oftentimes more important than any information itself. I would like to officially start a petition for more fantasy stories to start using mapamundi style maps. I don't know if any fantasy works have done that thus far, but please let me know if they have, because they're incredibly cool, and this really feels like an untapped market. Also in the comments, let me know what your favorite fantasy maps are so I can check those out. If you're interested in doing some further reading about this, Here Be Dragons is a great place to start when it comes to fantasy maps, and if you want to get into the history, especially the stuff I discussed here, World Maps from 1300 to 1492 is the book to read. I know that the title doesn't seem exciting and that it looks really dense, but I swear, it was a really fun read. And I don't know what that says about me that I consider that a fun read. I want to give a huge shout out to the folks on my Patreon Discord who, when I mentioned that I was doing a video about maps, immediately provided me with like 5 or 6 different books that I could read for this video. I love the amount of power that nerds have when you gather them together and ask them obscure questions. It really is incredible. My Patreon, as well as my full works cited, are linked in the description if you want to check either of those out. Give this video a like and share it with your friend that you think would really enjoy this very specific wormhole, because I know that we all have that friend, and maybe we are that friend. So, you know, send it to someone who you think would enjoy it, because that really helps me out. And do consider subscribing if you want to tune back in every week to hear me talk about the kind of stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hoppity day.